announcements. Next week for Arts and Medicine, Dr. Joe Gao will be back with us, and he will be doing a presentation on chirality, handedness in science, medicine, art, and architecture, a philatelic journey. Philately will get you nowhere. Okay, this is good. Thank you. Also, looking forward, next Wednesday, November 19th, from noon to 2, over at the library, we are celebrating the 500th birthday of Andreas Vesalius. So we're having a birthday party over at the library. And our speaker today for Arts and Medicine, Professor Gabriel Finkelstein, will actually be presenting next Wednesday, that's November 19th, from noon to 2 p.m. He will be speaking on Vesalius at 500. We'll have refreshments and an opportunity to view the original first edition. I think we have two volumes in the library, the Vesalius. You cannot eat your cookies near the Vesalius, however. So those two things won't be happening simultaneously. Also, next Wednesday on the 19th at 7 p.m. is a concert, open and free to the public here on campus with the Melomanias Orchestra as well as the Arrhythmias Choir. So please try to attend. It's an extraordinary event. Is that it? I think Dr. Klayman has one more announcement.
Thank you. A reminder that the Human Touch for 2015 is underway, and the submission deadline is December 15th. So this, as you know, is our annual Anschutz Medical Campus anthology of poetry, prose, photography, and graphic art. And this will be the 8th annual volume. So there are flyers. It's all done electronically, you might guess. And the flyers with the URL are out on the table outside.
So we are very happy and honored to have Gabriel Finkelstein, Associate Professor of History from the University of Colorado, Denver, with us today. He'll be talking about the neuroscientific origins of modern culture and telling us all about Emil du Bois-Reymond. Professor Finkelstein's book is actually available for sale and, I hope, signing after his presentation today.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Tess Jones and Henry Klayman, for inviting me to present today. It's a great honor to be here to talk about my life's work, Emil du Bois-Reymond. I'll try to keep this pretty short so we have time for questions, and then if you have to go to another class, that's okay. So today is November 10th. Maybe I should start out by saying that Emil du Bois-Reymond had his birthday 3 days ago on November 7th. He would have been 196 years old. He was born in 1818, the same year as Karl Marx, Frederick Douglass, who else? Maybe Ivan Turgenev, and formed part of a generation of interesting 19th century physicians, biologists, and public figures that are unfortunately relatively unknown today. Oh, there he is. People refer to him as Saturnine. Hermann von Helmholtz once remarked to his wife that du Bois-Reymond looked like a Swiss bus driver. He was born, that's his French name comes from his Huguenot background. His father was a Swiss immigrant from the Principality of Neuchâtel in French-speaking Switzerland, which was a possession of Prussia at the time that his father was born. He came to Berlin as a young man, ended up getting a job as the Minister for External Affairs for the Principality of Neuchâtel. Went into early retirement in 1848 after Revolution, liberated the canton. Du Bois-Reymond's mother was born Ninette Henri. She's from an older Huguenot family. They had emigrated a few hundred years before. As you all recall, in 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, which was the Edict of Toleration between French Protestants and French Catholics. And a lot of French Protestants emigrated in consequence because they were persecuted in France. They came to the Netherlands, Britain, the United States, and to Prussia, of all places. So Emil du Bois-Reymond's great-great-grandfather was the first silk dyer in Berlin, and he had a very storied background. His grandfather was the president of the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin, was known as the German Hogarth. The man whose name I can't really pronounce, his name is Horawiecki. And du Bois-Reymond came from a family of scholars and painters. His father-in-law was a royal librarian, and his aunt was a famous painter. And as a young man, du Bois-Reymond wanted to be an artist himself. He didn't end up doing that. He's probably better known for his work in neuroscience. You can see he just co-discovered the action current, became professor at the University of Berlin in 1858 when he was 40. At that time, the University of Berlin was the most important university in the world. So he was the professor of physiology there. In other words, the leading biologist at the leading university of the world. He was quite famous. He was considered by some people to be the foremost naturalist, that's an exact quotation, in Europe. And that is comparing him to Darwin and Pasteur. He also was elected permanent secretary of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. He was voted in membership in 1851, I believe, at a very young age. And because of those two positions, his position as professor at the university and as permanent secretary, had lots of opportunity to give formal lectures, which he used. And that is the second source of his fame, are his collected addresses, which were widely reprinted. He was somewhat of a spokesman for science. He was like I suppose, Stephen Jay Gould of his day. His addresses were reprinted in German and widely circulated in the most popular journal of culture, sort of the New York Review of Books, in a sense, of its day. It was modeled after a French review, and also translated into several other languages. And these addresses sold quite well. And that's basically the source of du Bois-Reymond's fame. So let me tell you a little bit about his background, his development, and then I want to focus most of my attention today on his public addresses because I think you'll find them the most interesting. Although I will cover a little bit of his science since I expect some of you may be quite interested in his neuroscience. Well, when he started out, he sort of attended university directionless. He didn't know really what he wanted to study. He fell under the influence of a famous Naturphilosoph, which is an untranslatable term for kind of romantic science that existed in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century. The guy's name was Henrik Steffens, and du Bois-Reymond was very interested in this all-encompassing theories of life and nature and self. Because of Steffens' influence, du Bois-Reymond's second term at the university, at the end of his year in the summer of, when was that? He was 20 years old, so it was the summer of 1838. He went to the University of Bonn, which was also a Prussian university that was famous for Naturphilosophie. But he became disillusioned with this romantic approach to science and felt that he didn't get anything done in Bonn. So he came back, to his father's great relief, back to Berlin, the University of Berlin, to study sciences, and eventually switched. He decided, and this is quite interesting, I think, to you, he decided that the best way to study biology was to enroll as a medical student, that he would get a better education in the medical school in biology than if he just continued in the liberal arts faculty. So he came under influence of another young man who basically said, what you need to do is enroll in the medical school and study with most famous naturalist at that time in Germany, whose name was Johannes Müller, who was often called the German Cuvier. He was a famous anatomist, physiologist, and naturalist, marine biologist. And then du Bois-Reymond was handed by Müller a treatise from the Italian physician and physiologist Carlo Matteucci in 1841 on animal electricity. Müller said to du Bois-Reymond, this would be something for you. Du Bois-Reymond was also interested in the hard sciences. He learned experimental physics in Berlin from two famous professors, Heinrich Dove and Gustav Magnus. Magnus was famous for having this large collection of physical apparatus, and he would let select students into his lab, learn the techniques of experimental physics. So animal electricity, what you'd call biophysics, was a perfect topic suited for du Bois-Reymond because he knew the techniques of experiment that he learned in Magnus's lab, and he was interested in the sciences of life. And in fact, he and his buddies, who would meet for drinks after experimenting at Magnus's lab, eventually formed the Berlin Society of Physics. That was a club that du Bois-Reymond started in 1845 and was president of as well. So that approach, and essentially it was a reductionist approach to studying life function. It was du Bois-Reymond in 1842 with his best friend Ernst Brücke, who's probably best known as Freud's teacher in Vienna, the professor of physiology in Vienna, who was appointed in 1849. Du Bois-Reymond and Brücke said, well, we are going to approach biology with the presumption that there are no other forces acting in biology other than those that can be found in chemistry or physics. There's no life force, no vitalism. It's an anti-vitalist approach. What's really interesting about that is that they did it for clerical reasons, or rather anti-clerical reasons. They felt that the church, and in particular the Catholic Church, was miring their nation in the past, and that the way forward for Germany and for science was to have a completely rationalist, physicalist understanding of the world. And that's quite interesting, I think. A lot of people don't know that, but the background to the origin of energy conservation, which du Bois-Reymond popularized. Du Bois-Reymond was friends with Hermann von Helmholtz, one of the discoverers of the law of energy conservation. Helmholtz first gave his paper to du Bois-Reymond's club, this Berlin Society of Physics. Du Bois-Reymond read it and realized how brilliant it was. But the background really is this medical, anti-clerical background. And Helmholtz was trying to show that for everything that goes into a living organism, you can measure everything that goes out, waste, work, heat, and that there is nothing missing in that equation, in and out, in the balance. There's no special life force, there's no vitalism, there are no spirits at work. I didn't know that, by the way, as an aside. When I was studying history of physics, I had no idea that there was a biomedical and anti-clerical background to energy conservation. And that's how I got interested in this guy, du Bois-Reymond, because just as his advisor handed him a treatise on animal electricity that was written by Carlo Matteucci and said, this is something for you, so too my teacher said to me, I was a physics major as an undergraduate, said, hey, you're interested in Germany, you're interested in Berlin. Maybe you'd be interested in working on du Bois-Reymond. And I said, sure. Du Bois-Reymond received that treatise in 1841 and spent the remainder of his career working on animal electricity. And I was tipped off the second semester in graduate school in 1988, and I'd finished my book, published it last November. So there's Helmholtz, as I just mentioned, kind of serious young man. What is the great import of du Bois-Reymond's work in biophysics? Well, it's pretty simple. He basically just transferred the techniques that he learned in the physics lab to the biological lab. And as I put it, recast Carlo Matteucci's experiments in instrumental idiom. I added the third sentence just recently because I can't remember where I saw it. It was either Nature or Science. They said, what are the most cited papers, scientific papers in the 20th century? And what they found was the most cited papers are papers in biology that report the innovation of a new laboratory technique. They have the more citations than any other. So that is in effect what du Bois-Reymond done. He created an entirely new laboratory technique to investigate the function of the peripheral nervous system. Basically, what he did was he solved the problem of contact electricity between his metal electrodes and the living tissue. So he had a very primitive recording device. It was a galvanometer. It records small charges or currents. Du Bois-Reymond came up with a kind of buffer between the organic tissue and the metal electrode so that he would eliminate spurious responses. And with that primitive galvanometer, he was able to show a change or diminution in current when a nerve or muscle is stimulated. In a sense, what we would call the action potential or action current. Okay, there's his apparatus. He drew that, by the way, so he did have artistic talent. It just only appeared in the engravings to his big treatise. So what you see there is the gastrocnemius muscle of a frog. That's the thigh muscle there, situated across two wads of blotting paper. That's the sort of those are in a sense the electrodes, so to speak. And those wads of blotting paper are sitting in varnished glass vessels that off screen you don't see what's going on, but they're attached to the leads of a galvanometer. So in the stand on top, you have metal electrodes. You can barely make out, but the metal electrodes are lying across a length of nerve that is attached to that thigh muscle. The stuff on the right is just an adjustable stand, so you can adjust the height. And then you see a couple wires. What's not shown is the source of electricity. In this case, it would be a magnetoelectrometer, a device that produces alternating current that's designed to shock the nerve, stimulate a condition of tetanus in the muscle, and then du Bois-Reymond would record the resulting swing of the galvanometer needle in response to that stimulus. Now, he did that stuff in 1843. He discovered the action current. Then in 1847, what he wanted to show was that the same nerve signal existed in a higher organism that was alive and intact. It wasn't an excised bit of calf muscle, but was in fact himself. So using his familiarity with physics, he essentially created a Wheatstone bridge circuit, which is a kind of electrical balance. And his arms formed the two arms of that Wheatstone bridge. And what he would do is he would measure the difference in current between one arm and the other arm when he completely flexed all the muscles of one arm but left the other arm limp. Right? So what you see him doing there is his right arm is flexed and tensed to create a condition of tetanus in the muscles. His fingers are holding onto a wooden bar, and his hands holding onto the wooden bar. His index fingers are dipping into that, what's called a deriving vessel that has platinum plates that lead to the galvanometer, which in this illustration you can see. It's on the stand to the right of him on the wall. It's not attached to the table because he doesn't want to shake it when he tenses all the muscles in one arm. His left arm is completely limp, right? And then the direction of arrows shows the direction of current in the bridge circuit across his whole body. And he's able to show that if he puts both arms or both fingers in the driving vessels and waits, the galvanometer needle will come to rest at a point of equilibrium. When he tenses all the muscles in one arm, the needle will swing dramatically. So he thought that he had showed with this experiment the first physical demonstration of the effect of the human will in an instrument, right? He's got his mind causes his arm to tense, and there's a physical manifestation or physical response of that action, and he can show it. He was very proud of this. The great patron saint of Prussian science, Alexander von Humboldt, in his 80s climbed the stairs of du Bois-Reymond's tiny two-bedroom apartment where he'd been doing his experiments to see this experiment. Humboldt himself had worked on animal electricity in his youth. Humboldt was completely flabbergasted, wrote a letter to his friend, François Arago, who was the president of the Academy of Sciences in Paris, where Humboldt had spent 19 years in his youth and got to know people very well, said, "You've got to see this." Humboldt arranged an invitation. Du Bois-Reymond went to Paris to demonstrate his new techniques and his new discoveries. Was in Paris for 6 weeks, met everybody there, demonstrated before the French Academy of Sciences, who had a mixed response. There is a French newspaper illustrating, there's probably a better illustration of Du Bois-Reymond, illustrating him performing the very same experiment in Paris, same equipment. What was the response? Well, in France, they couldn't really entirely appreciate the significance of using instruments to study life function. They thought that Du Bois-Reymond had been greatly ingenious in inventing new techniques and creating a new field, but they weren't entirely convinced that what he had demonstrated wasn't an artifact of his instruments. After all, Magendie and other members of the committee said, well, how could he be sure that when he cut the frog legs, that didn't produce some spurious response that wasn't there in an intact live animal? And Du Bois-Reymond worked for years to try to demonstrate that, in fact, it wasn't a spurious response. He was never able to convincingly do so. And he came back home kind of depressed and frustrated. He expected a warm welcome in France due to his fluency in French and the ingeniousness of his discoveries, and he kind of met a mixed and indifferent response, and he was greatly frustrated. He had a better response in England. Shortly thereafter, in 1850, Henry Bence-Jones, who some of you may know from Bence-Jones proteins, but Henry Bence-Jones was a chemist and a physician who was Darwin's physician, personal physician. He was also the sort of director of the Royal Institution in London, a great sort of venue of popular science that had been started by Humphrey Davy, and Michael Faraday was still alive when Bence-Jones was there in Victorian London. Bence-Jones came, he'd heard of Du Bois-Reymond's innovations, was very interested, came to Berlin, visited Du Bois-Reymond, learned his techniques, and invited him back to London to give a series of lectures at the Royal Institution, which Du Bois-Reymond did in the 1850s. So he met a much more favorable response in England, but at that time, physiology in England was greatly behind the state that it was in Germany, and Du Bois-Reymond was facing some difficulty advancing in his career, and he thought of actually going over to England. He ultimately made 4 trips to London. He thought of going over to England to take a job at the University of Oxford, in fact. But he finally decided that he would rather be in a cultural backwater, as he put it, but scientific paradise, which was Berlin, than in a cultural paradise and scientific backwater, which was London. So he could also live a lot more on his wife's inheritance, a lot better in Prussia than he could in Britain, which was very expensive. So it took him a long time to get a job, thought of working all over. Finally, in 1858, his advisor died, and he inherited the position, so to speak. And he was 40 by the time he got tenure. Okay. So his marriage. Now, this was the part of the biography I had no preparation for. I found a cache of hundreds of letters between du Bois-Reymond and his fiancée and then his wife. She was his second cousin once removed, also Huguenot, but she came from a part of the family that engaged in trade rather than science and art. Her father was a merchant who was in Valparaiso, Chile, and she grew up in Chile speaking Spanish, and her dad died when she was young. She moved back with her mother and her brothers to England, where the rest of the family, and particularly the uncle, was based, and grew up in the Lake District. You know, you've heard of Windermere and Grassmere Lake. I know there's a lake, I think, in Washington Park. It's called Grassmere. It's named after some of the lakes in the Lake District. So she grew up there, and she was friends with John Davy and Harriet Martineau and other luminaries of the scene in northern England. Du Bois met her when she was 16 and come sort of on a marriage tour to visit potential suitors in Prussia. He didn't think much of her then, but when his career began to stall and he got frustrated, what's interesting is he decided to take a second look at her, and she was quite an interesting young woman. She was about 15 years younger than he was. And he basically went to England on Bence Jones' invitation to court his wife. Now, he used the science as a means to get at her, which is very interesting. He went to London, then he took a little side trip to visit his cousin. His cousin had this nice daughter, and she found him quite attractive, so they got engaged. Engagements took a long time. Their letters would go back and forth over the year of their engagement. Then he went back to England, married her, went on a trip, brought her through Germany, brought her back to Berlin. Now what's interesting is that because she's English and he was German, he explained life in Germany to her in almost anthropological detail, like what her future life was going to be. And he was kind of embarrassed that he wasn't going to be able to offer her the same degree of opportunity that an intelligent middle-class woman in England would have faced. He said, we're behind, you're going to have to fit in, you're not going to be able to do as much, but I'm going to try to make it interesting for you here in Germany. So he explained absolutely everything. And I found this a wonderful source for du Bois-Reymond's biography. There she is. Not the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen, but people who met her said that she was very interesting, very intelligent. They ended up having 10 children, one of whom died. So they had 5 girls and 4 boys. With her money, because she'd inherited money from her dad, he was able to buy this summer home in Potsdam. It doesn't exist anymore. It was this beautiful Palladian villa with vines and gardens and fountain. You can see the balcony that is covered by vines is the one that is outside du Bois-Reymond's study. So he wrote his lectures in that room. But the house was destroyed in the Second World War. It's just gone. Okay. One of his daughters, all of his children were brilliant. One, for example, Claude, became professor of ophthalmology, was one of the first 3 professors at a new medical school in Shanghai. Went to Shanghai in 1907, came back after the First World War, learned Chinese fluently. In fact, his collection of stuff that he got in China forms the heart of an ethnographic collection I found in Göttingen, translated Mulan, you know, the Disney story, but the famous story, into German. Other daughters were photographers. Du Bois-Reymond was very interested in photography. This is a picture of taken by one of Du Bois-Reymond's daughters of his his children, her siblings. That's a boat that's English. He created this sort of English paradise there in Potsdam. His kids were all sporty, girls including the boys. Very, very progressive guy. There are his grandkids. Marvelous picture. Large families. It was sort of like it is now. It was a thing for upper middle class people to have very, very large families. That part's interesting. Okay, so now we're moving into the stuff I think you're probably most interested in today, which is his addresses. So when he became professor, his career in science began to stall because he ran into the limitations of his physical apparatus, what he could discover. So he started to understand that he had authority as this professor, and he was a good speaker, and he shifted more and more to become a spokesman of science. So he first started to give popular lectures on recent innovations in science, and these popular lectures became the most popular class at the University of Berlin, in fact. It's said that 800 people would crowd into the largest auditorium of the University of Berlin, standing room only. They were standing in the hallways to hear du Bois-Reymond lecture. Quite incredible to imagine that. Then, inspired by the response that he got from his students, he started to give formal lectures and publish them. And he was it turns out he's a brilliant polymath. He's obviously fluent in French and German. His English was absolutely beautiful. He said he spoke English with hardly an accent. I also know he spoke Italian. The guy was really an amazing person. I found out he was the third scholar of nationalism after Acton and one other guy. In a sense, he's the father of history of science because his popular lectures inspired others to compile popular lectures on the history of science, including the father of my field, George Sarton. That name means anything. He was a Belgian scholar, came to the United States in the 1920s, is often touted as the father of my field. George Sarton's inaugural lecture at the opening of the new Institute for History of Science at Harvard University exactly cribs one of du Bois-Reymond's arguments as the foundation for history of science. Basically, he makes the argument there's no cultural advance, there's very little political advance recorded over history. The only area of human endeavor that shows any progress demonstrably is science. Therefore, the history of science is the true history of humanity. That was du Bois-Reymond's argument. Kind of an interesting argument to make. So du Bois-Reymond is interesting as a cultural historian because at the time when history was being established as a discipline, du Bois-Reymond was making the argument that political history is really beside the point. What one should study is culture and, more importantly, science. Now, in these addresses, he wasn't without criticism, which is kind of interesting. But, oh, by the way, I should add, the man who got me interested in history of science was Jacob Bronowski. When I was a boy, I think I was 10 or 11, there was that show on PBS called The Ascent of Man. It was absolutely brilliant. Bronowski would walk around, and I was just spellbound by his genius. So Bronowski's history of science is also modeled on du Bois-Reymond's, by the way. Well, du Bois-Reymond was not without criticism, unlike Bronowski, who was sort of touting science. Du Bois-Reymond realized that science wasn't an unalloyed boon to humanity, that it was the measure of cultural progress, but there were problems with it. And this may all strike a note. He said large projects altered the relationship between scientists and their experiments. He was worried about short-term careerism. And actually, du Bois-Reymond, in the lecture on cultural history, said, well, science is a true measure of civilization, but civilization is threatened by two sources. And he said, one, the first threat to civilization, he said, it's not political, it's not communism. That's what everyone was worried about, particularly after the commune in Paris, the uprising there in 1871. He said, we don't have to worry about the socialists. He said, what will threaten science is the following two things. One, we'll run out of fuel, fossil fuels, and there'll be environmental degradation. And the Earth will not be inhabitable in the future. He said that. He said that in 1876. Bright guy. He also said, science will destroy civilization. Here's his quote. That science will destroy all values It's a bit like Marx. Marx said, money will destroy everything. It's a universal acid, right? It will destroy all values. Everything will just be reducible to the dollar sign. Du Bois-Reymond said, it's a little bit subtler. He said, science will destroy everything because all we'll have left is instrumentality, right? We'll have a world that is only practical and only pragmatic and only instrumental, and nothing else will be left. He had a name for this process of turning everything into science. He called it, and he coined the word, he called it Americanization. 1876. So, what else did he do? I discovered, this was unknown to the scholars of Darwin, he was the first German professor to convert to Darwinism. As I mentioned, Henry Bence-Jones, his best English friend, was Darwin's personal physician. Du Bois-Reymond was in contact with Bence-Jones. Bence-Jones knew about Darwin's work on his big book and alerted him to its publication. It came out in November 1859, as you all know. Du Bois-Reymond wasn't among the 300 or so that received the first edition, but he got his hands on the second edition, which came out, I believe, at the end of January or early February of 1860. He read it over spring break. So by April of 1860, he's writing back to Bence-Jones saying he's a convert to Darwin's argument. Now, this is remarkable because Ernst Mayr, who died just a few years ago, is one of the contributors to the modern synthesis. Ernst Mayr, in his famous History of Biology in the 20th century, said, among the first people to encounter Darwin's theory, there are no physiologists who believed in it. It's only naturalists, right? Yet here is a German physiologist who converted to Darwin's theory right when he read it. Even though he complained that Darwin's exposition, as he put it, lacked clarity. You know, a lot of people had trouble making sense of Darwin's argument. So I tried to figure out, why is this physiologist an adherent of Darwin? And he starts teaching Darwin right away. In those popular lectures that I mentioned on recent innovations in science, in the winter of 1861, Du Bois-Reymond is teaching Darwin's theory in its modern, complete form. I have the notes. I looked at them. It's really quite remarkable. Before anyone else in Germany, before Haeckel said, Ernst Haeckel, the naturalist, said he was doing it in 1863, but Du Bois-Reymond was doing it in 1861. And he's doing it at the University of Berlin, which is the leading institution in Germany and the world, to large classes, and no one seems to mind. So I thought, why is Du Bois-Reymond an adherent of Darwin? And I realized it's because of the influence of Lucretius. In 1838, you recall I mentioned he repudiated this sort of romantic approach to science, and he takes this hard-nosed approach to biological reductionism. And essentially, he read, and he wrote to his dad, this is what I'm reading. He read On the Nature of Things, this famous poem by the Roman philosopher Lucretius, which is a sort of popular exposition of Democritus's view, or Epicurus's view, either one, of the natural world. It's a world that is devoid of the supernatural, a world that's rational, progressive, evolving, where the goal of life is to reach a kind of state of quietude, a sort of Zen state that will come with knowledge, staying out of politics and staying out of the marketplace. So Du Bois-Reymond became an adherent to Lucretius, and in a sense, Darwin extended this Lucretian mechanistic outlook from the laboratory, as I argue, to the field, to the world of large organisms. So I think that's why he liked Darwin. Taught the theory in 1861. Nobody cared. There's no responses, no censorship, hardly even a note of protest. But in 1883, Du Bois-Reymond gave a short obituary to Darwin, and then the stuff hit the fan. People were very angry at him because he said in the obituary that Darwin is the Copernicus of the natural world, in the same way that Copernicus recentered our understanding of ourselves from the Earth-centered universe to the solar-centered universe. So Darwin recentered our understanding of ourselves as living organisms, right, where man is no longer the center of things, but forms a part of a network of organisms. When he said that, he was attacked severely by the Catholics and the conservatives. And they called for his imprisonment. They accused him of treason because at that point we weren't supposed to say anything anti-Christian. But du Bois-Reymond, this is very interesting, this point. He knew he could get away with it because anything said ex cathedra, in other words, anything he said in the course of his regular duties as a professor or a member of the Academy of Sciences, was protected speech. He couldn't be censored for anything that he said officially. So he could stand in front of the Prussian king and his ministers and say the most controversial things and face no retribution for those remarks, whereas other people would be imprisoned. That's interesting. That freedom of speech, sadly, is no longer afforded to professors in this country. Now, his other famous address that he's known for are these addresses on the limits of science. This is perhaps what he's most famous for, and this may be of greatest interest to the neuroscientists in the room, because at the end of his life, du Bois-Reymond essentially compiled thoughts that he started to get again in 1861. Going back, this is pointing out the relation between teaching and research. In the course of giving the lectures, or the course of actually writing up the notes for those popular lectures on science, du Bois-Reymond realized that in his Lucretian worldview, there would be two areas that could never be explained by a mechanistic understanding of the world. One of them was the nature of atoms themselves. They are beyond our comprehension. That's sort of, you can think of that as a lower limit of scientific understanding. And the upper epistemological limit, du Bois-Reymond said, was consciousness. The mind itself would never be reducible to matter and motion. We could understand the brain all we wanted. We'd never get at consciousness itself. There would be an unbridgeable gap. And the word gap, the explanatory gap, is in fact du Bois-Reymond's own language. So he said that first in 1872. He faced a lot of flack for stating that there were limits to science. In 1880, he gave a different version of that talk, where he talked about 7 enigmas of science. He said some we'll probably understand. Some he thought were transcendental, we'll never understand. He thought, like, origin of the universe, he thought we'll never understand where the universe came from, or never understand this original source of matter and motion. And he said consciousness was beyond our understanding. He later sort of, he stepped back a little bit. He said, not absolutely, but he said he severely doubted that we'd ever understand consciousness. Now, his arguments, by the way, have been repeated to this day, and I'm often frustrated by modern philosophers of mind who repeat his arguments in much more abstruse language, don't add anything new, and forget to cite them. So, there you go. Now, what about the influence? I'm running out of time here. Briefly mentioned, he was a big celebrity, not only in Berlin, not only in Germany, but in the world. I mean, his picture was hanging up for sale, like you'd buy a rock star poster. His picture was hanging up for sale in Berlin bookstores on the professors of the University of Berlin, the big stars on one side, and then the royal family, the Prussian royal family on the other side. So, you know, if you're a good German patriot, you'd have the Prussian royal family, and then the professors. Those were the days, I guess. Okay. So, who wanted to study with du Bois-Reymond? Well, Sigmund Freud wanted to study. You know, he'd heard about him from du Bois-Remond's best German friend, Ernst Brücke. Freud planned a trip to Berlin, never made it. But Freud, in a famous lecture, said that psychoanalysis was the third great revolution in the history of science. He said, after Darwin and Copernicus, not citing du Bois-Reymond. Okay? Who else? As I discovered, well, not me, but there's a new biography coming out of Ivan Pavlov. A colleague of mine has been working 35 years on it. Pavlov's teacher, Sechenov, Ivan Sechenov, studied directly with du Bois-Reymond. He's in 1863, he found the concept of inhibition, the vagus nerve. You all know about that. Okay. That was Pavlov's teacher, so there's a direct link there. And then, probably most interestingly, and as far as I can tell, no one knows this, William James, in 1867 or 8, went to Berlin with the express purpose of taking du Bois-Reymond's classes in electrophysiology. This is not in any James biography that I've been able to unearth. He went in and basically flunked out. I looked at James's lecture notes, and they start off okay, and then they just degenerate into doodles and caricatures of his classmates, and then he just talks about having a breakdown. He flunked out. He couldn't do it for whatever reason. The science was too hard. The German was too hard. He was too depressed. So James was haunted by du Bois-Reymond because he went to Berlin to learn the secrets of the mind, or at least of the brain, from one of the world experts, and he couldn't hack it. Then du Bois-Reymond had him cornered intellectually with the philosophy, because du Bois-Reymond said, well, the biologically reductionist outlook to the mind is something that we're never going to grasp. We're never going to get to the heart of consciousness. So James basically, I don't know how else to put this, but he freaked out. And he said, well, if that's science, I'm rejecting science, okay? And I'm going to invent my own new field, and he called it pragmatism, right? I'm just going to assert that free will is not a chimera, that I'm in possession of it, and he went off and started, he's the father of psychology in America. So this is, I don't think anyone has pointed this out. Ernst Mach didn't like him. Wittgenstein in the Tractatus directly responds against du Bois-Reymond's prescription of limits. He says, I don't like that. And then here's something interesting. In computer science, I don't know if these guys are familiar names, but Georg Cantor, the father of transfinite mathematics, borrows du Bois-Reymond's argument. Du Bois-Reymond makes that argument in 1872. Du Bois-Reymond's brother was a mathematician, takes a version of that argument. For those familiar, Cantor's diagonal proof is borrowed on Paul du Bois-Reymond's mathematical argument, which I believe came from Emil du Bois-Reymond. So, transfinite mathematics, Kurt Gödel, and the proof that any axiomatic system is either inconsistent or incomplete, in a sense, is a modern logical formulation in the 1930s of something du Bois-Reymond said in 1872. And for those particularly interested in computer science, the sort of computational version of Gödel is Alfred Tarski, also from du Bois-Reymond. Then literature, Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev, du Bois-Reymond's exact contemporary, studied at the University of Berlin, knew about him, right? Models the character of Bazarov in Fathers and Sons directly on du Bois-Reymond and Ivan Sechenov, his student. It's kind of an amalgam. In another book, Smoke, he mentions du Bois-Reymond by name. I believe Flaubert's last book, Bouvard et Pécuchet, is a meditation on the limitations of knowledge, which is inspired by du Bois-Reymond. So harder to prove. Pio Baroja, a Spanish writer I was unfamiliar with, wrote a book called The Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life. Du Bois-Reymond's reference there. And most interesting perhaps to you guys in contemporary culture, Stanislav Lem wrote a book called Solaris in the 1960s that became a famous movie in Russian by one of the greatest Russian filmmakers ever. It was remade by George Clooney into a Hollywood non-blockbuster. But two tropes in du Bois-Reymond's lecture on the limits of science are apparent in this movie. One is that of a planetary intelligence, or a supreme intelligence. That is Solaris in the book. And then also the idea of clones or duplicate people. Du Bois-Reymond said if you could reproduce Caesar atom for atom, you would also reproduce Caesar's mind, memories, and aptitudes. You'd have an exact replication of Caesar's mind if you replicated Caesar's body. And that appears again, as you all know, in Solaris, if you've seen the movie or read the book. So he had a big impact on the 20th century. I think I'm down to my last slide. What about you guys? How does this affect you guys? Well, I thought hard about what I'd say today. It's interesting that a leading figure of culture and celebrity and influence in the 19th century was a dean of a medical school and a medical professor and a biomedical researcher. And I would say that's because he chose that. He wanted that. He didn't have to be that way. He could have stayed in the lab, would have had a great career, but he chose to become a public figure and use his scientific authority to reach a broader public and shape the world in the direction that he thought. And I think that's interesting for you to contemplate today. The scientist as celebrity. Because that's a career you may or may not want to pursue. The other thing that's interesting is that du Bois-Reymond was a voice of ethical caution, both in science and in politics. He suggested limits to scientific knowledge, that science wasn't going to be the answer of everything. He pointed up problems in the modern world. He spoke out against anti-Semitism. He spoke out against violent nationalism. He advocated science as an international foundation of cooperation and understanding. So he's really, to my mind, he's heroic. And most interestingly, he did this all with the understanding that just as his heroes, Johannes Müller and Alexander von Humboldt, were utterly forgotten by the time he came to prominence, so too, he, in the future, would be utterly forgotten, despite all his celebrity and all of his achievements. And he is today, sadly, utterly forgotten. Thank you.
Well, if you can stay for a few minutes for questions and answers, questions and comments, I'm sorry, and be sure and press the button when you speak.
Okay.
Well, this is not a criticism. It was a very good talk. If he was so famous in his lifetime, and yet nobody believed what he had to say, what was he famous for?
Oh, they did believe him, and just not everybody believed him. Which part didn't they believe? You mean the science or the pronouncements, the cultural pronouncements?
The public pronouncements.
Oh, well, some people did believe him, but he received a lot of negative comments. His voice was a minority voice, but he did have adherents. I mean, people were obviously buying his lectures.
Did he do anything significant in the laboratory after the discovery of the action current?
Not really. He made all of his discoveries more or less in 6 months. He refined those discoveries. It took him 6 years. Then it was 60 years between, effectively, 1843 and 1902, when Bernstein more or less elucidated the action signal in modern terms. So science is slow and hard.
Hold it down. Yeah, okay. Wonderful talk, Gabriel. The Franco-Prussian War, did he express an opinion on that and the immediate unification of Germany? Where did he stand on these things?
Well, on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, he was outraged at Louis Napoleon, like most scholars and intellectuals and professors, and he gave a very patriotic speech on the 4th of September, 1870, right after the outbreak of hostilities. And he said terrible things about France. He said terrible things about Louis Napoleon. And he said terrible things about French culture, most of which were true, which the French never forgave him for because it really cut. Because he knew them, and he knew just where to stick the knife, right? He said they were nationalist, they were aggressive, they were following this, what we would call as proto-fascist. They had this, they'd mortgaged their future to this terrible careerist, right? And they were troublemakers, right? Now, later, he came to regret it. By 6 months later, already in January of 1871, he publicly expressed his remorse of the embitterment that the hostilities had produced and his remarks had produced. And then over the course of the 1870s, he worked to repair relations between Prussia and France. He said, and then he wrote a lecture on nationalism. kind of as peasant penance. And I think what he figured out is that his society was beginning to mirror all the terrible things he didn't like about French society. You know, this is often said, this is the tragedy of the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides, is that Thucydides shows how Athens becomes what it hates in the course of fighting it. And so too, Prussia became what it hated. And in my book, I don't say it, but I'll say it right now. So too, the United States, in my opinion, is becoming what it hates in the course of fighting it. So he tried to repair relations, but they never forgave him. Cross the line. You're not allowed to do those things. Yeah.
Do you think that his belief that there are things we can't discover is against the philosophy of science? And also, do you think that belief was a function of his time period or something unique to him?
No. Thank you. Thanks for coming, by the way. No, I don't think it's against philosophy of science. There are a lot of books written by philosophers of science, even now, about potential limits to rationality. There's a good one also by a colleague. It is published by MIT Press. So I will leave that to the philosophers of science. I mean, plenty of people are still saying this. It's not as popular as the people who say there are no limits, but I think it's interesting that du Bois-Reymond cautioned culturally against a view of transcendence as romantic and dangerous. And by the same token, I think that his example serves as a useful caution to our own society against our own society's sort of cultural impulses toward transcendence as romantic and dangerous. Americans believe they can overcome anything, right? Perhaps he's a useful lesson. So no, there's nothing unique to him or his society. I think it's just wisdom. Although as a historian, I'm not supposed to say that. Everything's supposed to be contextual, but I'm just stating my opinion. I think it's wise to figure out that there's some limits beyond which you cannot go. As you know, Dirty Harry said it, so it must be true.
Did he have anything to say about the discoveries of Sigmund Freud?
No, he talked about hypnosis, though. So that's an allusion to Freud and Charcot, right? And he thought that it was all nonsense. And he said it in a very witty and nasty way.
So it is.
I'm not qualified to judge. You had a question.
Yep, Mike Pasco here. So Emil seemed like a very innovative person of his time, and so that begs the question for me, if he were around in current times, do you think he would be very active on Twitter?
Yeah.
Would he have much to say, and would he
I
find
mean,
that appealing?
His style was loquacious and eloquent, but he was capable of biting remarks. So yeah, I'm sure. And Paul Cranfield, an earlier historian who was also a physiologist, said in the 1960s if you were to teleport Emil du Bois-Reymond from the 19th century to now, he would fit right into your labs. It'd take him 6 months to get up to speed, but it would make perfect sense to him. So yeah, he's a very modern guy. This is an interesting point because, you know, historians love to condescend because we know how the story works out, right? So it's an impulse of historians to condescend to their subjects. One of the greatest discoveries I had in studying this man was that I couldn't condescend to him. He's much smarter and wiser than I was, and he was trying to tell me something. Not that I knew his story. He was trying to communicate with me. So he doesn't fit our model of a great man, right, with terrible feet of clay. Like, you know, it's easy to condescend to Darwin as a racist, and it's easy to condescend to other figures in the 19th century as getting things slightly wrong. Du Bois-Reymond looks just like us, so it's unnerving. I think that might be one of the reasons that he's forgotten. He doesn't stand out as different. He would fit right in.
Any final question or comment?
Yes. I'm Earl Delap from the Department of Bioengineering. This is the second time I've listened to this talk. I think you first talked at the Neuroscience. It's a very interesting lecture. You mentioned something in the story arc of trying to complete your research on this man, that it was very difficult to acquire information because of the Second World War had destroyed much of the information. How much more could we possibly have known about this individual had that information not been destroyed or insufficiently followed?
Well, fortunately, most of his papers didn't get bombed. There's a 4-volume catalog of the 8,000 to 10,000 items in his papers. And I wasn't able to look at everything. I looked at a lot of it. But obviously, there's stuff that I never, colleagues often ask me, are you writing his biography in real time? Because it took me 25 years, right? So I wasn't able to look at everything. But I don't know. That's a really good question. In the same way that du Bois-Reymond talked about the limits of rational knowledge, scientific knowledge, he might represent the limit of historical knowledge. Because people in the 19th, and this isn't my argument, Walter Cannon, a historian of science, made this argument about the Victorian period in general. They wrote down so much, right? Even more than we record with those ridiculous cameras on our heads and in our rooms. They wrote down so much that, in a sense, these intellectual figures of the 19th century represent the limit of what could possibly be known about any individual and their immediate context, right? So that's the unspoken message of the biography, that a life or a human being is ultimately unknowable, right? That I attempted this project knowing that I was going to fail. It wouldn't matter how much more there were. If I had 1,000 lifetimes, I'd never get at the core of who this guy was. I could only guess, right? But I think that that's in my book, it's suggested more than expressed. But there you have it.
Thank you. And if you want to read more, you can buy the book right now. Thank you so much, Gabriel. This was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.